It's really a pleasure to be here today, and I can't thank all of you for taking time out of your extremely busy schedules. I know where we are in the fall semester, and it really starts picking up speed at this point for those of you all that are teaching in academic settings, either traditional or non-traditional. The fall always seems to be a very busy time, but it's also a good time to bring this topic to mind, that it's really, no time like the present to improve the statistical analysis of your tests and measures that you're using in your program. So that's really my purpose here today, is to give you a little bit of background on how to get the most out of your tests and how to systematically look at your data if you haven't already set that kind of program up for the benefit of both yourself, your students, and the program as a whole. So thank you, Carter, for that introduction. So who am I? Sounds like I'm somebody that's done a lot of stuff, and I certainly have in terms of nursing education, allied health, and particularly in tests and measurements. So my goal today will be to really, first of all, talk about how can you get a solid program of test analysis off the ground, or if you've at least started with that, how can you improve it so that you're really getting the most out of your test data and systematically reviewing it. Second purpose will be, is there any one facet here of test analysis that you should be spending time on? In my opinion, you really need to be looking not only at information coming off of your tests to help the individual student, but you should maximize that to be able to look at your class performance as a whole and glean some additional information from that. And even further, you should be able to get a good idea about where improvements need to be made in the curriculum. So a lot of what this is about today is how do I get this started, or how do I improve what I'm already doing? First off the bat, there's really no point in doing analysis if you don't have a good test to begin with, because the heart of all this data, the student response data that you get from your test, really is only as valuable as the test itself. And if you don't have a good test, then the data will not be all that interesting and compelling, and unfortunately it can possibly even give you some wrong turns when you start making inferences from it. So I would encourage you to go back to your course objectives. If you really have objectives that you believe are too broad, not specific enough at all, then this is the time to get that under control. Make sure that your course objectives are really as specific as possible and that they reflect competencies that are important to you in your program. And I love the example from Q's, and I use them all the time because I believe they've done such a good job with identifying knowledge, skills, and attitudes in obviously this main content area of safety, but they've done it in such an organized way that that framework can be applied to other types of objectives that you write into your program. You certainly should be sure that your course schedule and your topical alignment of what's going on in the classroom, regardless of the style of activities there, in clinical, in simulation, in lab, everything needs to be aligned, and I usually call this alignment to reality. Stuff looks really pretty on a piece of paper, but if it's not congruent with what's actually happening in the classroom and in clinical and lab, there's likely to be a big disconnect when it comes down to time to evaluate students. And again, you'll get erroneous information from your analytics if you don't really have all that stuff lined up. This is the classic golden triangle of instruction. I've written about it in the Critical Thinking and Test Item Writing book that I had co-authored with Morrison and Flick. And this is really the heart of great instruction, and it's a testimonial back to Curriculum 101, if you remember from maybe your very first exposure to nursing education or the educator's role, that what's really important here is that all of these components have to, what I call, talk to each other. The faculty really needs to be sure that the course objectives are constructed in a way that you can really make some clear-cut decisions about how instruction needs to be crafted, because everything that you do needs to focus back in meeting those objectives. On top of that, you need to be choosing evaluation measures that are reflective of the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, but that also, in reverse order, really reflect what we were just talking about, what happens with objectives and instruction in your various clinical and classroom and lab settings. And then obviously the outcomes are the key here, what you're trying to measure. So you've hit that golden triangle, and when all of these four circles, the four bubbles, talk to each other, and that's what we would consider to be sound curriculum design. Sound curriculum design, to me, is always a goal. It's not maybe necessarily 100% achievable all the time, because there tends to be something interfering along the way with the evaluation loop, perhaps, but it certainly should be something that we need to be keeping in mind whenever we're working through the program. So if you dig into it, it really is a combination, and it's explained through the program philosophy. That's where we see good old outcomes and objectives again, the type of instructional methods that you choose to use. And then even though evaluation tools look like the last and largest component, for somebody like me that has spent so much time working on good measurement, it really is the heart of the golden triangle in the creation of sound curriculum. So some people like to flip this triangle the other way. I believe that evaluation tools are absolutely essential, and they have to support the rest of it. So I like them at the bottom of that pyramid. Good tests include good items. So how do you get there? I wish I could give you the magic bullet answer that you'll, wake up one morning and it will all come together. But in as Carter said, my decades of experience, that's actually never happened. So I don't want to give anybody false assurance that this is something that you can just suddenly overnight master. In truth, it really, really takes a lot of time and energy. So that means you've got to practice, and that means you've got to write some bad questions. In fact, for me, writing bad questions has actually been one of the areas that improved my test writing over time. I'm really big on redlining those, just like you all would redline a student paper, and pass them back and forth with your colleagues to invite feedback. And that's the only way to make these better. One of the most important things you need to do is to write those test items at the higher level of the cognitive taxonomy, because if you persist with items that are written at the lower levels, at the knowledge, comprehension, or some, as you know, recall that with the update in the taxonomy terminology, this would be things that would be just remembering. That's not going to get your students where they need to be, and it's certainly not going to generate the type of data that you need to be analyzing from your tests and measures unless you really truly have questions that are written at the application above level. So my encouragement there is to follow guidelines, be very disciplined about it. Don't waste your time writing knowledge-based type items. Really practice to get your items up to that application level, and don't give up. It's not going to be easy, but the rewards will be great, and the data that you'll glean from those tests that are written with the really, really good quality items will be, the data will be so much more effective, and your analysis will be much more on target with understanding where students are and where your program really is as a whole. So think about what makes test items really and truly critically thinking items. In other words, yeah, we can go back to Bloom and the taxonomy, but on top of that, you really need to think about what Richard Paul said, who's known as the founder of the whole critical thinking theory, that in this case, you got to think about your own thinking. So that means your test items need to be more clear, more accurate, and that will ultimately make your entire test more defensible if you've really added that level of granularity to your test item writing. So I'll just kind of summarize this in about 5 key points to really improve the quality of the data that you get from your test-taking experience that your students have. You've got to have good questions, and the best way to develop your effective critically thinking item writing style is to assemble some basics, and those are the things we're going to talk about today. These are some of the basic psychometric measures that you absolutely have to attend to from test to test as you deliver your test and improve the items and then give it to the next group of students. you have to intentionally write those questions at a critically thinking level. So that means you got to engage for application and above and really create some items that are very, very clear, and they point to very defensible, say, rationales when you're constructing those to help explain to the student why the correct answer was correct and all the other answers were not correct. Do pay attention to some housekeeping duties along the way. These would simply be things that clean up your test formatting and style, that make them consistent. To me, there's nothing more distracting than reading a test that looks like it was put together by a committee, and lo and behold, it probably was, because you have test questions written by different people coming out of different time frames and courses, and no coherent piece to it. And it's very distracting for the student to see the format changing from question to question. It's much better to attend to these formatting things and make everything along the same style lines. It's absolutely critical that you have a test blueprint that's really, again, part of your defensibility in terms of the value of that measure and its ability to measure the objectives that you set out for the students to accomplish. Really need to do this electronically. And that's where a software program like what ExamSoft has available can be such a huge benefit. It will not only save you time as compared to trying to put something like this together manually, but it will incorporate so many more facets of the questions, the objectives, the level of items that you're including, all in a single document that you can get out as a report from that software system. And then finally, you really need to analyze everything that's going on with your exams. And this is the area that I see many faculty struggle with. To be honest, a lot of times the first unit exam that they give in the semester can be really awesome. They've had additional time to improve the questions, perhaps, before the semester really starts heating up. But then as things get busy in clinical and students start having difficulties and they need more one-to-one instruction, and all these kinds of things start to snowball, that's also the point in time when your time gets to be very, very precious. And so one of the shortcuts that sometimes will happen is the questions on the Unit 2 exam or maybe the Unit 3 exam really don't get that kind of scrutiny so much so as the ones at the beginning of the semester. And the downside to that is that you lose the power of being able to analyze that test and improve it. So you're a little bit destined to repeat the same process over again when you bring in a new cohort of students to that course. So if we can get this analysis piece down to a more functional level where you can really just kind of tick off of a checklist or something like that as a systematic way of looking at your exams after you give them, it's going to save you time, and it's going to make the process probably a little bit more relevant so that you don't skip over it, particularly as you get down the busy part of the semester. There are some considerations when you're writing your critically thinking test items. These alternate test item formats are becoming more and more commonplace, and the technology behind the test administration software applications have allowed for greater type of flexibility with the format. Although I think it's interesting to note that in many cases, though, you still generate much the same type of data. So from a statistical point of view, you're still going to be delivering dichotomous data out of each of these questions, meaning that the student will choose one correct answer or a group of correct answers and everything else will be wrong. So it doesn't mean that you have to change the way that you conduct your statistical analysis of the test results just because the alternative item formats are included. In some cases, you do want to eliminate them, and I'll give you some examples. Obviously, if you've got something that wouldn't deliver a dichotomous answer, if it's a short answer that you've added to the more objective response type of questions, then it becomes more difficult to include. Or if you've had mastery items that have been intentionally placed on the exam where you expect the class to answer all of these correctly, that will be another reason why you'd exclude some of these items from your analysis. But for the most part, even with the alternate item formats included on your test, you can get some really, really good statistical data from the analysis. So what should you do at the end of your test? Obviously, you should go back to your statistical hallmarks, those measures that are the most important in letting you know that your test was really sound, and that would be clearly indicators of reliability and validity. Do this review after every test, and my rule of thumb is that I don't release grades to the students under any kind of circumstance until I've had the opportunity to complete the systematic analysis, and in some cases, until I've had the chance to complete it and do a little cross-validation with a colleague to ensure that we've really covered all the bases and we're satisfied with the test and the decisions we've made. Otherwise, you get pushed into a situation where you're standing behind grades that can be obviously very significant from the student's point of view, and certainly from an admission, progression, or graduation decision point can be extremely important, and you don't want to do that without the statistical analysis being complete. So as a review of these, the most common measures of reliability, and you'll see these reflected in your software application like ExamSoft has for each and every test that you create in it. You really want a measure of consistency of scores. So the KR20 is the most common that we see in a testing situation. You really get a sense through the KR20 if you've got consistency in scores. So if students are performing well and their scores are good, that's going to be the trend that the KR20 will support that that's actually happening. The worst thing you want is a unreliable test, one that the strong student is, they get a high grade when they answer the questions one time, and then another strong student will come in and they'll get a low grade from the same test. Then you've lost your ability to really stand behind that test and indicate that it's a truly reliable exam. So you need a measure, just like that thermometer, you need something that will give you consistency of scores. You also need a discrimination index, and there's a couple different ways to do this, but you need a discrimination index that will help you differentiate between those who know and can apply the content and those who can't. And that, again, is based on these correlations between the students' responses across the entire exam. You can use an IDR, the item discrimination ratio, probably not as precise a statistic for distinguishing that discrimination index, but certainly doable, and that's one that you can literally probably compute in your head. But my goal is to not have to compute any of that stuff, leave that to the software application, have it deliver the KR20 to you and the PBCC at the end of every test. Then your job is to pick up that information and start making some decisions about it. So the first thing you want to do is have some type of standard of acceptance that you and your faculty colleagues have agreed upon as the acceptable values for your program. And I call these general. These are the type that you'll find in the educational psychology textbooks and anything you see on tests and measures. We do have to make a few considerations, I believe, for nursing students in particular that are taking application-style tests who are at the very end of their curriculum, because these general standards may not be that useful. But in terms of standards of acceptance, generally speaking, any test item that you have on your test that comes back with less than 30% of the group answering the item correctly, that's the one situation where you absolutely got to take action. And that's why a systematic review of your test data can be so important when you're making those grading decisions. You either need to make a decision about giving credit for more than one answer or nullifying the item. That's kind of a whole different webinar related to how you would handle decisions with test policy. But the bottom line is 30% that's really the hard line. Anybody that would keep a question active in an exam is really not going to learn anything about their students' capability from retaining an item with that kind of p-value, because by chance alone somebody could have gotten it correct. On the other hand, 90% is really the upper avenue. At that point, you get 90% of the class that's getting the item right. You have to ask yourself, is this item too easy, or was this, in that one special situation that I mentioned earlier, was it a mastery item, which indicates that you would expect all students to get that correct. If that's the case, and you do find that testing is your best method for validating their knowledge, then I would indeed include it, but I wouldn't waste your time nor the students' time by including more than 10% of mastery items on any exam. There are other ways to assess mastery. Direct observation of skills would be a good example to me of a more classic way of assessing for mastery of the entire class over a critical content piece. But basically, once you get a test item that 90% of the students or above can answer correctly, it's really probably shouldn't be on the test. Certainly if it's not within that 10% of items that you had designated prior to giving the test as being true mastery items. The IDR that I mentioned, which takes into account the students' scores in the upper 27% versus the lower 27% of the class, should be at 25% or above, but the better item discrimination statistic that I think you should attend to is that PGCC. At least 0.20 and above would be ideal, and that really shows you that the test item is truly able to discriminate which students really understand and know how to apply the material versus which do not. Now, I will say that there's a misnomer out there. A lot of times people think that if an item is really, really difficult, it will inherently have good item discrimination, and that's actually not necessarily the case. So increasing difficulty may or may not result in a good item. So overall, and then of course the KR20 of 0.7 and above, generally speaking, would be excellent. A lot of times it's really difficult to get to these standards of acceptance when you're, as I said, dealing with a class of nursing students that may be approaching their final semester. The reason for that is that many of these folks have had very, very similar clinical experiences. They're a much more homogeneous population, say, than a classic general education class where you might have large numbers of students with very diverse educational backgrounds. Think of, a bunch of students coming into History 101 or English 101 as part of their gen ed experience. But in nursing, when you've got this group of students who now really have met very, very similar admission criteria, they've been through very similar clinical experiences, classroom situation, as you move through the curriculum, it's going to be harder to see a lot of variance in this population. So we can relax a little bit on the standards of acceptance so that when you're getting a test together, you don't feel like you're under so much pressure to try to adhere to those general guidelines. But still, I think the KR20 should be certainly at least 0.60. You really try to achieve 0.60 to 0.65, of course, above. And the point by serial, at least 0.15 rather than 0.20 would still be acceptable. So now that you understand which portions of test analysis need to occur, I really encourage you to apply this every time you give the exam. Do it in this kind of order. You can walk through the report and make sure that all of these areas are addressed. Look at your p-values for every question. Do review your discrimination data. If you've got a test that has a large number of items that are really poorly discriminating, in other words, you don't see a real clear delineation between the students that do real well, know their content, know how to apply it, versus those that don't, those questions need more editing. And that's why it's very difficult to write a really good test question out of the bat. You can use this information now statistically to come back and guide your editing. And then I think one of the most helpful areas as part of your systematic analysis is to look at the response frequencies for the student responses to each and every question. So I'm going to show you an example of some reports that come from the ExamSoft application. And that's why I'm hoping you'll see from this kind of illustration that having a good software application to collect the data and display it can be so impactful for you. It saves you tons of time. It gives you a very good set of visuals right off the bat as to how the students are performing and also how your test is performing. So I think some of the areas that will be important to look at and graphically see where most of these test items were on the cognitive taxonomy. Here's that response frequency information by question. And notice that the zeros highlight up. That's one of the areas where you can make probably the biggest change in the quality of your test question simply by reversing this process of having a bunch of zeros. Those particular options that you're offering in the multiple choice question here are absolutely not supplying the students with anything that's enticing, even the ones who don't have much knowledge in this content area, to choose them. So what might have been a good multiple choice question here with 4 or 5 options almost boils down to becoming a true-false question, because these are non-players when you see those zeros. So I think you can see that rather than panic about, oh my gosh, I got to rewrite this entire test. No, you can be a little bit more surgical, frankly, about it. You can go in and pinpoint the areas that you want to improve upon, and you may actually be able to salvage quite a few of these questions and make these questions much more functional. When you look at them statistically, you'll be able to get this relatively easy question. We now see it so easy because you can eliminate a couple of these distractors. They're probably just not even plausible. So the student is really not even considering those as being potentially right answers, even if they have not much strength in that content area themselves. But you'd be able to eliminate this on the next go round with this test question, not see 91% of people getting that question correct. Storing the data, I think that's all I want to say about that is that a software application like ExamSoft can certainly improve your overall longitudinal view of test data because you can store that data. You don't simply get a look at one class and then it's gone, but you could store it and review it over time, and I think that's where you get the most benefit because you can see how that test question might have been altered and how the statistical information coming off of the student responses to it can improve. The other piece here that just to take a quick look at validity, this is around that same hallmark of reliability and validity with that test to make it the best tool that you can. My viewpoint on this is that the test blueprint, particularly when it's electronically generated through the software application, can really be quite important when it comes down to defending that test and the ability of that test to measure the objectives that you had designed as part of your curriculum content and what you really want to check the students' capabilities against. The electronically generated blueprint has so much more data than one that you would generate manually. So like a typical manual blueprint might only hit the highlights of the types of specialty areas you might be covering. So an adult health class, maybe you've got a cardiovascular or respiratory unit that you're covering. You've got 4 questions on cardiovascular assessment, maybe an equal amount on respiratory. When you start putting the test together, you can frame it out yourself from that type of brief faculty-generated or manually generated test blueprint, but it's just not going to have the depth necessary to really make that test defensible, particularly if you get a student objection, student does poorly on the test. Students are smart. They can figure out that, or at least make that assertion perhaps, that the test was not a fair measurement tool because it didn't actually reflect the content that was presented. in the classroom or that was designated over the objectives that they were supposed to have mastered for that portion of the course. So the electronically generated blueprint solves all of that, makes it completely not a disputed fact anymore when you've lined up those course objectives inside the application and you're actually pulling the item bank questions that have been earmarked for each of those objectives. So I really encourage the use of test blueprinting from an electronic application. It's a much more defensible report that you can offer in support of the test being a valid instrument. And then you couple that with the reliability indicators, and you've really got a very, very strong evidence for your measurement tool. Store that information. So it is worthwhile. If you look at this suggested category list, I know the print is very, very small, but this is something that ExamSoft can supply. And the advantage here is that with the computer application, you're able to store almost, like infinite level of categories as certain kinds of scoring categories come up that you want to add to the list. You're able to do that. When you're working with just manual creation of test items and without the storage that's capable with one of these software applications, you lose that power to have this level of granularity attached to each of your test items. So as the test item is being written, if these are your particular categories of interest, you can assign that test item a level in the Bloom taxonomy, one of the nursing process components, one of the client needs from NCLEX. Then you can go into more detail with levels of specialty. And then this would be a great example of, you could keep an entire listing of your item bank available just at the push of a button. You can get a report out and show how many questions you have dedicated across each of these categories. Very, very powerful tool. So let's turn now. You know how to make a good test. You know how to write these good questions. And now you know which statistical components you really ought to be tracking. How can you make that analysis even more powerful? So everybody wants to do the Monday morning quarterbacking after the test is over, and that's important to do. But what I'm going to encourage you to do is go one step further than that. Besides just completing the analysis on the individual test, what you really need to do is you need to go forward at the individual student level so that you can create an individualized remediation plan for the student. And then you need to take some steps to look at the information coming off of that test at the level of the class or the cohort, and then across all cohorts as it relates to your overall curriculum. So when we dig into individual student results, one of the things that I would really encourage you to do is to go for those more subcategory, those more granular scores. So maybe the NCLEX client needs right now would be one of the ways that you have your item bank earmarked with physiologic, psychosocial indicators in the safe, effective care environment and such. But underneath each of those, using some of the suggested subcategories that are part of the NCLEX test plan that you can get through the National Council's website, or if you have a particular scheme that you're using, if you still have a systems approach, if you've got functional patterns, whatever your nomenclature is that you have, be sure that those subcategories are reflected in your item bank. So when it comes time for the student to really understand where their difficulties might have been on a test, instead of the student's typical behavior, which is to focus on the specifics inside of the STEM so that they can grasp at straws basically, or try to grab a clue from something in the STEM of your question that they're hoping they will identify when the very same question comes up again. And of course you all know they don't want to include any of those questions that they've already seen on any of your subsequent versions, because they'll simply latch on to that in their memory, and it doesn't tell you that they learned how to apply knowledge when they re-answer that question the second time around. So instead of getting them, get them off of that mode where they're stuck inside the stems, and instead try to pull back to more of the subcategory level. So if it's a very clear pattern that they're struggling with items related to safety all along, whether it's been a test question that related to a skill, or whether it was a test question that related to the home environment or the hospital environment for a patient. That's the kind of theme that they need to recognize, and your subcategory scores will point them in those directions, and that will be a basis for you to show them, look, these are where your strengths or your weaknesses are. And the important piece of this is if you see similar trends occurring on other exams that are given in other courses, that makes that even more powerful, because it's telling you they're not, for whatever reason, they're really not picking up on that particular content area and applying the information. So regardless of whether they're in PD or whether they're in one of the adult health classes or whether they're in one of the mental health classes, if you continue to see problems with safety, then that will show up as a trend, because your item bank carries all that information about each test question in the category list that will allow you to see it on the report. One of the things that can help you with that, if you don't have your item banks completely built out with categories, this is an example of a listing that was supplied as kind of that default list from ExamSoft for the teacher-made test item bank. Dosage calculations can be reflected. Well, in a standardized test, you may see the exact same thing, maybe different language here, math, but it's getting at the same thing. So once you have category scores that are key indicators that you've woven throughout your item bank for all of your unit exams, and those mirror what you're seeing on your standardized test, you've also increased the power of your analysis that you're bringing back to the student. And that's when I would encourage you to do some of these correlations with what you see happening with individual student results on their unit exams. Are you seeing the same kind of deficits, for instance, that pop up on the standardized test? And if you've got the categories linked in a way that cues you to that, it makes the remediation plan, which I hope you're doing in the form of a student contract, even more important, because you can really get very specific then about what you want the student to accomplish to address these deficit areas. And then certainly as you're planning for your future unit exam or your final exam, you need to cover that area. If you're really concerned that the student is not remediating effectively, or if you've seen a pattern of that behavior, it's important to continue to re-examine those areas on future tests, because you're trying ultimately to build as good of an objective record of the student's capabilities as you can. What about for your class? Well, this is where trends and comparisons can be even more helpful. So what I would recommend is same thing, both major and subcategories, so major and minor ones that are similar across unit exams in your program, and then are also cross-referenced into whatever standardized program you might be using for standardized tests. How do those mean scores look? Because you can do a similar kind of comparison that you did with the individual student score. Now you use the class mean as your point for comparison. And if you've got the same cohort that is exhibiting similar trends, so, you know, we pick on one of these content areas, let's say the growth and development area just was never strong coming out of fundamentals, and as these students have moved into second level of program, same problem, you're still seeing that same thing. That'll give us some very powerful data, because there needs to be an intervention then that addresses this situation with the entire class. And sometimes, as we know, some of those content areas you may have illustrated really great in your syllabi for your courses, but some things change. Maybe you're in a different clinical agency, or maybe the faculty assigned to the course has changed. And for some reason, one of those content areas is now really not getting the same attention, or in some way suffering, and you're seeing that weakness in the cohort results because you're taking the time to compare their mean scores. Sometimes even just a fast trend line will help you. So this was an example where I plotted out the scores for, and you could do this either for mean scores for the class, or the same thing would hold true for individual student scores. I plotted their unit test scores against their standardized scores in the same content areas. And this is what you want to see. So the guy that's at the top of the class on the unit exams has also really got a lock on it as far as the standardized test goes. The students that have been weak are still weak on both types of tests. What you're hoping not to see, obviously, is if your trend line isn't that strong, that would bring up the question of, well, gee, why would I be seeing really high unit scores and maybe that's not playing out? I'm not seeing similarity on the standardized test scores. It gives you the opportunity to start asking those questions earlier in the program, particularly as they relate for the entire class, to see if there's something else that needs to be done as you prepare those students for the capstone course and exiting the program. And that kind of brings us to how to really improve your overall analysis of your exams. Well, clearly, if you have a testing committee that's charged with not only collecting this data, but going backwards and doing some analysis, you can get some observations made that frankly might be really, really important for the curriculum as a whole. And I think the most important thing I see with this is many times faculty are heightened to do this as a process of, oh my goodness, we've got to get ready for a reaffirmation of our accreditation. We've got visitors coming, and there's a big scramble to try to get that information put together, almost what feels like the last minute. Instead, if there's a testing policy that has organized how this is going to be managed, then you won't have a last minute scramble. You'll be getting some really high quality data coming off of each test that is delivered in your program, and the analysis will already be there. So you should have a very good feel for strengths and weaknesses and may already be showing how you've closed the evaluation loop to improve those areas that were not as wonderful as you thought they were maybe when you started the process of getting your self-study together. And finally, I always explain this, it's very good to do a double check. What do the other evaluation measures tell you? Because you've got a whole host of them in your program, or you should have more than simply the unit tests and the standardized tests. What are you seeing in terms of clinical evaluation? What are the outcomes from simulation? In fact, now with the movement to even have some of those simulation activities really put into the form of an assessment themselves. I think that's where the double checking can be very important, because you don't want to see one area of measurement being a true outlier for what's happening in other areas of measurement. So students doing remarkably well on unit tests, but struggling on standardized tests, not meeting objectives in clinical, that would be a red flag. What's going on? Is there a problem with too much of the test items being out? And that means that it's time to overhaul the item bank so that you can be assured that you're getting legitimate data from the tests that you deliver. Always include these kinds of considerations when you're forming a test committee that will in turn recommend policies of faculty. So there should be some writing style considerations that I mentioned earlier in the webinar with acceptable versus not acceptable formats. And don't be afraid to send those questions back and say, I'm sorry, we can't include these in the item bank until they meet the style guidelines. And then there should be some requirements about this, the old Monday morning quarterbacking for the test. So after a test is done, no, it's not acceptable to wait till next semester to gather all that information. There should be some clear-cut documentation. I've created some examples of very, very quick types of forms that you can require faculty to submit to the testing committee that basically just show that they've reviewed some of the standardized reporting that comes out of your testing application. So some of these ExamSoft type reports, it's not only that those have been generated from the application, but they've been reviewed. And importantly, if there are any follow-up activities that have been identified by the course coordinators, say, that need to be done, the test committee can be very helpful in pulling all that information together and making sure the follow-up activities have indeed occurred. So hopefully for many of you, this may have been just a quick reminder of everything from Curriculum 101. How do I know that I've got a solid plan in place? Can I actually create an educator's golden triangle from what I currently have available to me in terms of objectives and instructional design, evaluation, and my outcomes. Can I generate a test blueprint? I certainly need testing software to generate the statistical analysis as well as the electronically generated blueprint. If you've got all these together, chances are you're on your way to an outstanding test and measurement review. You've really done your homework in getting your statistical analysis together, and importantly, you get the most out of your testing. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'll turn this back over to Carter.
Very cool. So it looks like we have right at 10 minutes or so for a Q&A. Just kind of going through the questions that we've gotten in so far. There's one that is ExamSoft specific that, if it's okay with you, Dr. Nibert, I will go ahead and answer.
Sure.
Okay. Isn't the benefit of using a product by a company like ATI or HESI, isn't one of the benefits that you get with those companies that they give you an item bank full of stock items already? And I don't think that's true of HESI, but I do think it's true of ATI, if I remember correctly. Am I correct there?
Yeah, I mean, many of the standardized testing companies will supply the content as well as obviously the software for actually delivering the exam. I think the difference, though, is that many times the standardized test companies are only supplying an instrument that's really intended to be used at the end of the course or at the end of the program, which is great. But meanwhile, what's happening in that area, what we call more along the lines of formative evaluation. So what's happening with quizzes and with unit tests versus more of a summative type tool, which would be these things given at end of course or end of program. So it seems that there's a real need here for some complementary types of analysis to go on. Yes, indeed, it might be very similar statistical indicators, and those test companies should be supplying things like KR20s and those point by serial correlation coefficients or any of those kind of measures, as well as general information about the test blueprints, so that you know you're getting reliable and valid testing. But I think on top of that, many times, unfortunately, what I see is sometimes the unit tests then become an afterthought, whereas the truth is that the electronically generated blueprint, for instance, is just as important or maybe more important because you are in a formative evaluation mode with those. And you've got the ability, if you see a deficit on unit exam 1, you can reincorporate that material in your teaching in that course and re-examine it again on a later unit test before they even get to the final. It might be extremely important to do that.
Right, and one thing that I would add on top of that also is that with ExamSoft, you could also tag all of your items back to the programmatic or institutional standards that you need to be tracking. So you're also able to generate data, about some sort of specific initiative that you have going on that you might need to report back to your board of nursing. And it's my understanding that with something like ATI, those categories are already set up for you versus you having the flexibility to set them yourself. Okay, so another question, and this is one that I've gotten on a different webinar before, so it's kind of interesting that it popped up again. Why does a KR20 sometimes differ between groups of students taking the same exam?
Well, I think probably the best way to answer that question, if you're using literally the same questions, but remember you've got a different group of students, it could have I guess somewhat to do with changes in the ordering of the questions, which is at some point should be randomized, or it frankly could be seen if those questions have lost some of their capability of truly being application above. So example being, if a group of students took the same exam in the spring semester this year and there was a lot of chatter about it and a lot of cross-pollination, I call it, between the students then that are arriving at the same course in the fall semester. The downside to that is that those students then will walk in with knowledge of test content that the students in the spring did not have, and that can really mess up your analysis with that test. Because remember, like I said before, instead of those questions being truly application level, where the student's having to apply critical thinking skills to differentiate between some options that may be very plausible and really having to think those through and apply the knowledge necessary, if they're walking in with too many cues, then they're eliminating answers because somebody's told them to, not because they actually know what they're really doing in that content area. And it can really play havoc with your analysis. So I would be very cautious about that. I would look further than beyond just the KR20 alone. I would actually look and see if the overall difficulty level of the test had changed with that latest cohort coming in. Are they finding these questions to be far more easier? That might be a cue that there's frankly been overexposure of those test items. And there, ways to control for that. Things like not offering a review of the test content again. In other words, they don't get to see those questions after the test is over, period, for any reason. That can help preserve the integrity of your item bank and reduce the available knowledge that students might have if they're prone to share that information with another class.
Very nice. Okay, another question. Do you have any advice on how frequently students should be tested for knowledge?
Well, I think, this is, again, really something that I think the faculty as a whole should consider when they're putting that curriculum together and doing some analysis. There's clearly concern about over-testing. And I think one of the things that has made testing easier, as I mentioned to the good, is the software program that pulls in all of your analytics, and it makes the test easier to put together because the blueprint is almost literally in front of you as you're building the test with items from your item bank. The downside might be that there's too much of a good thing going on. I think to strike the happy balance, though, what you really need to do is assume that students are going to walk in without a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge, particularly in those alternate item format type questions, and that's going to increase some of their anxiety. So anything that you can do to reduce some of their anxiety is probably to a bonus. So I'm one that believes a lot in quizzes, but I don't like to put quizzes in a big old high stakes, high pressure mode. I like it to be more along the lines of a check yourself. I think it's very valid to use a software program like ExamSoft to generate quizzes because it is easier for the instructor to do when they have a tool like that they can work with. But instead, use it for some creative stuff like making it a ticket for the student to enter an application activity, maybe a simulation or a case study or something that's going to happen in the class. If they don't have the basic knowledge that will make them an active participant, then they really don't need to be there. They need to go back and do what they needed to do to get ready for that class. So I see some power in being able to even increase the number of objective measures if you use it in the form of quizzes, but I wouldn't want it to be a negative where every little thing turns into a big high-stakes drama, because then I think it can be counterproductive. And I guess one little coda to that. Also, don't forget that there are other measures simply, besides the tests themselves to use for evaluation. And there's a lot of popularity now with group testing, and I think some of that allows students to share their test-taking strategies and their knowledge together. But I think you have to very clearly demarcate this was a group shared experience, but tomorrow when we actually do the unit exam, that's not a shared experience, so that you can be very clear with your delineators as to what would be considered professional ethical behavior in a testing situation versus in something that's not considered to be a true testing situation.
Perfect. Right now we have 1 more minute until 3 p.m. Or 4 p.m. if you're on the East Coast. But there is one more question that I'm really interested in hearing your answer for. Can you do that?
Sure.
Cool. This one's about testing committees. If an item is not okay, what are the consequences? Just whenever you're thinking about just that idea of putting in some kind of consequence system for what happens whenever an item is not, whenever the stats aren't showing this is a good item. The audience member pointed out that this is actually peer review. And so in order to really give that peer review process for your exam and assessment item creation, how do you incentivize that? Do you award the test committee some power? Do you, make an incentive structure for faculty members who have good items all the time? What do you do there?
Wow, that is an interesting concept. I mean, I think that, for years there have been committee structures in schools. We've probably pretty classically had a student affairs committee, or that's now become probably more popularly known as the progression, admission, progression, and graduation would be their realm. I think the testing committee is it's a assignment that carries as easily as much weight as a person that has to chair the student affairs committee, and a lot of times all of these folks need to be in collaboration. So one of the models that might work is that each of those committees would be observed with whatever same rights and privileges happen if you're serving on student affairs or you're serving, in this case, on the testing committee. But they all should come back to the faculty, possibly. That would be one model, so that final decisions really need to be made, or they should, in a larger school, at least come back to the curriculum committee, that group that's been charged with looking at the integrity of the whole curriculum. Incentivizing is a great idea. I frankly, it's an interesting concept, and I don't have anything right off the top of my head, but it seems like if you indeed have somebody who's been recognized as really having a grip on some of this information, and they're willing to share that, it seems like that might be some opportunity to generate some education for the rest of the faculty. I know sometimes just a brown bag session can be motivating with the school pitching in the dessert or something, so that people will work on test item writing together. There's nothing so lonely as trying to, fix a broken test item all by yourself, but there's a little bit of safety in numbers there, and do what you can to make it a fun experience. That's really the way to improve your item bank over time. It's not going to happen immediately, and you got to work on a little bit of it at a pace that is doable. But it's certainly great to increase that skill across the faculty. At least, somebody that's the guru at each level would be really, really great.
Very nice. Well, we're 2 minutes over. I want to thank you, Ainslie, for your time, and also thank all of the audience members that we had sit in on this webinar. I think it's been really informative for all of us. I know I learned a lot. Just another reminder, whenever you X out of the GoToWebinar control panel over on the right-hand side of your screen, a survey will pop up. Please take a minute to fill out that survey. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and close out the webinar. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Nibert. This has been really good.
And thanks, participants.
Signing off.